Hi everyone, this is the first video in a pair of videos I'm going to do that talks about education in colonial America from the perspective of, on one hand, functionalism and on the other hand, conflict theory. Really I'm going to talk about the differences in colonial education between regions, especially the North, Massachusetts, especially New England, and the South, so Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina especially. I'm going to look at each region from each perspective, so I'm going to talk about how functionalism would see education in the North, and then how functionalism would see education in the South. And then in the next video, I'm going to talk about how conflict theory would see education in the North and education in the South. So here we go. Education in the North became public and became a much more matter of public concern and was funded publicly much faster than it did in the South. If you remember, functionalism sees education as primarily filling social needs. That is, education does specific social functions, things society needs to survive. So in colonial America in the North, this was a society founded largely for religious reasons. These were the Pilgrims and the Mayflower and all the rest of that. So schools evolved to fulfill these communal religious functions. One of the very important things for the Puritans who settled in Massachusetts and elsewhere was to maintain their religious traditions and maintain the integrity of their community. And so schools fit into that larger function. So public schools, which developed in the North far faster than they did in the South, were designed to supplement the family's place of educating their children in religious traditions. So ultimately, or primarily, the responsibility was the family. The family taught children their religious traditions, and it sort of gave them initial instruction in literacy and things like that. But schools were designed to supplement that instruction. So schools taught children how to read and write. And why were they teaching children how to read and write? Primarily so they could read the Bible. Schools taught and reinforced the fairly strict Puritan moral code. Why? Because Puritans believed that's what God intended them to do, and if they strayed from that code, they ran the risk of being tempted by the devil and going to hell. So schools served the social function of reinforcing the communal religious orientation of the Puritans of New England. That's how functionalists would see it, that the society needed something done, that is, reinforcing and making stronger the communal and religious bonds, and schools sort of fit and did that function. In the South, things were very different. It took public schools much longer to evolve, and public schools were unheard of in the South, really until well past the Revolution. And so that's largely because there's a different sort of people in the South. The South was not settled for religious purposes. The people that settled in the South were there primarily for commercial purposes. They were there to make money, and primarily through agriculture. And so the functionalist would see these two facts, right? One, a capitalist agricultural economy in the South, and two, the lack of public school development in the South, and they would connect them through a functionalist analysis. That is, in the South, the driving forces of society were agriculture and profit. And so for those things, that is, in order to have a successful farm, essentially, you didn't really need schools. That is, children would learn the skills to work on a farm through farming, through their parents and through their neighbors and things like that. So there was no social function that public schools could fill, which would explain the relatively slow development of public schooling in the South. And there were significant differences. I mean, the first public school type law was passed in Massachusetts in the mid-17th century that required towns to set aside money to pay teachers and eventually to build a school for all the children of that town. And the explicit purpose of that law was to educate children in the religious traditions of the Puritans. No such laws existed in the South for a long time, well into the 19th century. And so the functionalist would explain that difference by saying there were different types of societies, and schools would fill different types of functions in each. And there was no function that the school needed to fill in the South, which explains why schools took so long, public schools took so long to develop in the South. Conflict theory would have a very different sort of explanation of that difference, which is what the next video will discuss.